Dune needs more space Muslims, is the cry, at once bizarre and predictable, from several mainstream outlets this week. The Washington Post, Slate Magazine, and NBC News all published variants of the same piece with the same opinion, because nothing is more radical than conformative views. Each one points out, correctly, that author Frank Herbert incorporated a good deal of his own studies of Islam into his fictional universe. The film, because it has at least one eye on its source material, which is hardly a given these days, does likewise. Then as Vileneuve's production extended this beyond mere tropes and ideas, as indeed did Herbert himself, it extends to the choice of casting and its literary equivalent, the creation of characters. We'll come on to Herbert's magpie-ish borrowings shortly, but the new blockbuster took care to cast a number of black and African actors in prominent roles. This, however, was not enough for the critics. The use of tropes, imagery, and the borrowing of themes is not sufficient for the modern Hollywood critic. It may, in fact, be a source of their criticism. For they have transcended the old-world belief that fiction is fiction and reality is reality, and though the twain shall meet, they do not perfectly overlap. For these critics, the fact there were no actual space Muslims in Hollywood's Dune is, to use a favourite phrase of the woke, problematic. Let's take a look at their offerings. NBC News first, where the headline is, Dune appropriates Islamic Middle Eastern tropes without real inclusion, critics say. It's like our homes and foods and songs and languages are just right for Western stories, but we humans are never enough to be in them, one critic said. I have to point out here that J.R. Tolkien's work is rooted in Englishness. His attempt, drawing on Norse and Celtic myths that were once present in England, but which time and evil Italian colonialists expunged, you and I know them as Romans, he had in mind to reconstruct a distinctively English mythos, and the themes and characters involved in The Lord of the Rings, in particular the hobbits of the quaint English village that is the Shire, were expressions of a particularly English ideal. None of the hobbits in Peter Jackson's adaptation were English, and nor were the hobbits in the books actually English. As a work of fiction, it incorporated themes, settings, feelings, morals, ideas, and values. It did not include people in their actuality. Yet I don't recall headlines in any newspaper at the time, granted I was only about 10 when the films came out, but nevertheless, complaining that none of the hobbits in the films or in the books were actually English. That would be absurd. Just as absurd is complaining about the absence of actual Muslims in Dune, a book series and a film set on a fictional faraway planet called Arrakis. Far and wide, though the Prophet conquered, there is no evidence, even in the Quran, that he made it as far as outer space, even on his winged horse. It would then be most unusual to expect actual space Muslims to exist anywhere. The problem, let's be clear, is with the casting choices, at least according to these critics. Though it featured a significant portion of black and African actors, it did not feature actors specifically from North Africa, a problem that rather fades in consequence when you consider that almost a third of sub-Saharan Africans are themselves Muslim, and there is a sizable and notable Muslim contingent among blacks of other extractions. NBC News continues, Dune uses explicit Islamic imagery and cultural elements, experts say, but the main cast doesn't feature a Middle Eastern or a North African, aka MENA, actor in a prominent role. That's another acronym for you to forget. It's an erasure, said Serena Rasool, a casting director and founder of Muslim American Casting. Viewers were quick to point this out on social media in the days after the film's release in theatres and on HBO Max. NBC says, Now, I am myself a journalist, and I regard this last as a cardinal sin in journalism. If your story rests on outrage on social media, you do not have a story. Social media exists to give outraged people a place to be outraged in order to score outrage points from other outraged people. NBC quotes, for instance, one Zaina Ujaili, I'm going to pronounce that wrong, I'll try it again, one Zaina Ujaili, who informs us that Dune is a racist white saviour narrative that relies on people's ignorance of Arab Islamic history to make itself creative, and thereby revealing that she has not read the books. NBC also quotes some talentless grifter who bemoans the film's cultural colonialism, a product of the bizarre race essentialist belief system that has popped up to give talentless grifters a sense of meaning and purpose. For these people, culture is A, localized, B, an immutable characteristic, C, something that in its fundamentals cannot be borrowed from, quoted, played upon, varied, amended, or used as inspiration by people from other cultures, because to do so is colonialism, and colonialism is bad. That these people make their complaints in the English language, on American keyboards built by cheap Chinese labour, and impress outlets which themselves form an integral part of Anglospheric culture in a way not quite comparable to any other, peddling sub-philosophical beliefs drawn from the French and metastasized by the Americans, and critique forms of drama drawn from the Greeks, ought to be a point against them. Just as the fact cultural assimilation is a symptom and a cause of progress, while cultural isolationism locks its subjects in the stases of our species' prehistory, ought to be a point against them, but it isn't. Cognitive dissonance at least requires cognition, and it is not evident that modern film critics are in any recognisable way cognitive. Slate magazine at least gets Frank Herbert's motives and techniques right. I'll quote here from Ali Kaju Ravari's review, because though it is broadly wrong, it is in places right. It's thoughtfully wrong, which is at least a respectable tradition. Here is Kaju Ravari. Herbert writes that his story began with a concept to do a long novel about the messianic convulsions which periodically inflict themselves on human societies. In so doing, he was particular that it was Western man who was the focus of his ire, who uses this messianic impulse to control other societies and further inflict himself on the environment. This is all correct, and it makes the charge that Dune is a white saviour story or a white saviour film appear as what it is, arrant nonsense. We might add that the charge generally is nonsense, a product of a post-colonial reimagining of the works of, say, Kipling's White Man's Burden, predicated on the misbelief that Kipling, who was not a progressive on matters racial by modern standards, but not a pig either, was advocating an avowedly and exclusively race supremacist form of imperialism, as opposed to what he was actually doing, which was encouraging the Americans to accept their undeniable place of power and privilege, to use some favourite buzzwords, and extend a civilizing influence to what was then and remains to some extent now an especially backward, benighted and poverty-stricken part of the world, the Philippines, in a mission that was intended to alleviate suffering by the extension of civilization. The whiteness of America is as incidental to the cause as was the brownness of the Moors in Andalusia, motivated by at least some of the same ideals, and their push northward through Spain, where one cleric observed that the further north one got, the whiter and dumber were the people. Not at that time an inaccurate observation, and one that is still accurate when one considers the Scots. It was a work predicated upon the recognition that empire is a fact more than it is an ideology. Race was incidental to it, save that it correlates with those in a position to do the civilizing, something Karl Marx acknowledged when he wrote in favour of colonialism precisely for the civilizing effects it had on barbaric peoples. Herbert, as Kaju Ravari correctly points out, was in fact writing against the unfortunately common corollary of empire-minded peoples, which is jingoism, supremacism, and a tendency to cock things up. This is a point that is well made against certain imperialist adventures by the British, more recently by the Americans, and particularly true of imperialist conquests by Muslim Arabs in Africa, with whom Herbert's sympathies in fact reside. He is a critic of messianic tendencies, be they secular or religious. And because he was an inventive writer, and invention relies on appropriation, he married this historically rooted and philosophical set of values with the facts of his time. The first Dune novel was published in 1965, when the United States had already been involved in a coup following Syria's independence in the late 40s, had backed both Mossadegh and the Shah of Iran in the 1950s, and had finally confirmed its replacement of the British following the Suez Crisis of 56, and meddled in both Jordan and Lebanon before the close of that decade. Writing in the 1970s and 80s, he was keenly aware of America's continued dalliances with and impositions on the Middle East. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan would have been fresh in the mind, as well as the American response. The Iran-Iraq war, likewise, in which America found herself on one side until she found herself on the other. The Iran hostage crisis, which played a not insignificant part in the ousting of Jimmy Carter and the election of Ronald Reagan. The occupation and then scuttle from Lebanon under that same president. The OPEC oil embargo. Herbert had plenty of geopolitical as well as philosophical and religious inspiration on which to draw, which is precisely why Dune emerges, not as another mere white saviour narrative, but as a decidedly more complex tale in which the author set out to undermine the kind of self-obsession that produces genuine white saviour types. He's far from the only writer of his day to do so, and film too provides an instructive and often ignominious history of America's typically short-sighted interest in regional affairs. Who can forget the closing message of Rambo 3, which thanks and praises the brave Mujahideen fighters of Afghanistan, who saved Rambo, if I recall correctly, before some time later giving birth to Al-Qaeda and murdering several thousand Americans. Take up the white man's burden indeed. Continuing with Kaji Ravari, after working on a story about sand dune control in Florence, Oregon, he was inspired to set his story on a desert planet. This led him to live for some time in the Sonoran Desert, as well as to, in his own words, a re-examination of Islam. Dune relies heavily on Islam to build its universe. For Herbert, Islam is a major part of human heritage and, by extension, its future. His use isn't simple window dressing either. It shows a deep engagement with both the beliefs and histories of a wide variety of Muslims. And he further complicates his uses by not confining his Muslim flavour to the Fremen, I think I've pronounced that correctly, the native people of Arrakis. Rather, he extends it throughout the story's universe, its peoples, religions, proverbs, and books. The Messiah he constructs is called a Mahdi, Kaji Ravari continues, a Muslim term that refers not only to a messianic end times figure, but to the many historical figures who have made a claim to that title. And history has seen many failed messiahs, Mahdis among them. I'm not sure it's seen any successful ones, I must add, but in any case, she continues. In his study of Mahdis and the jihads they led, the strongest influences on his story were the Sufi Muslims who fought against European colonialism in the 19th century. These include the Algerian Amir Abd al-Qadir al-Jaziri, who, like the Fremen, made weapons factories in the desert in his fight against the French, the Chechen Imam Shamil, who fought against the Russians, and in the most obvious of ways, the Mahdi of Sudan, Muhammad Ahmad ibn Abdullah, whose war against the British became a consistent feature of English literature for decades after his defeat. Kaji Ravari begins to come unstuck, however, with a short aside on the tedious attack on casting decisions, which leads then to the following paragraph. Herbert's shortcoming is not his idea that Western man seeks to exploit the deification of charismatic leaders, but that Arabs, or any other non-Western, would fall easily for it. This notion, in fact, builds on a stereotype that motivated European powers to fund propaganda among Muslims during the World Wars in the hope that they could provoke a global jihad against one another. Needless to say, that didn't happen because Islam isn't a warrior religion whose followers are just waiting for the right trigger to go berserk. Islam's followers are human and are as complicated and multifaceted as other humans. Herbert should have seen that more clearly. This begins as a boring incantation drawn from inciting Edward Said's Orientalism and is largely nonsense, being as it is rooted in ideals about history, not ideas about it, never mind the facts. In fact, the failure cited on Herbert's part is one of his successes. This policy by European powers and then by the Americans did succeed, and failure was its product. T.E. Lawrence is known as Lawrence of Arabia for precisely this reason, or at least the first part of this reason. The people who regarded him as a white saviour were not in the first instance the British, but rather the Arabs, among whom he lived and whom he inspired to battles, producing several notable, even remarkable victories. Tribal cultures are in large part defined by the deference paid to charismatic leaders with whom the Americans, by and large, failed to accommodate themselves in Afghanistan and to a lesser extent Iraq, and with whom the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and later Saddam Hussein's ousted Revolutionary Guard and later still Islamic State naturally dealt with better. The jihad that didn't happen did happen, as even a cursory glance at recent history shows, and it continues to happen. The elevation of recent despots from Gaddafi to Saddam, bin Laden, the House of Saud, and by mistake the Ayatollah Khomeini, both proves the tendency of tribes to be drawn to charismatic leaders and also the unending jihad that has followed. A more interesting critique, one with which Herbert himself might have had more sympathy, is that though this mindset may be and generally is more prevalent amongst tribal cultures, which name accurately describes significant parts of the Arab world as well as sub-Saharan Africa, it is similarly present in cultures around the world, from Confucian-infused communism of China, the love of strong men in Russia, the semi-mystical power of Emperor Hirohito in Japan, and the cries of "for God and King" that for centuries motivated the English to war with much of the world, unnecessarily and to our ultimate cost. These are ideas and themes that recur throughout history, and so they recur throughout art, especially narrative art like books and television and movies. It is not the casting choices of Vileneuve's Dune that erase the owners of a culture the more intelligent critics nonetheless try to disavow, but the claim that the people who inspire the book in fact bear no relation to the culture that informed it. To be clear, my objection here is not the usual one, which is that the infusion of politics generally into art that could do without it. I side with Orwell on these matters. The opinion that politics should have nothing to do with art is itself a political opinion. Rather, it is that the infusion here is an excuse for politics, not politics itself. It steadfastly elides what ought to be an important and enlightening discussion of the relation between art and culture and history and people, by reverting to the tired old grifting race essentialism that, while it pretends to be bold and radical, internationalist, progressive, even enlightened, in fact reduces all ideas to the most base of questions, the colour of your skin. Dune was and remains an important work, and the film, though necessarily diluted, remains admirably faithful to it. It's an invitation to learn, to appreciate, and to extol the genius by which it was created, genius that only exists because of cultural appropriation, and that could not exist without cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation is its genius. It is an opportunity to learn. We ought to be asking why it is we no longer produce works of its depth and its scope, and not complaining that its most superficial aspects do not comport with our most superficial concerns. To that question, these critics in fact provide the answer, though they typically don't have the wit to see it.